Welcome back for another deep dive with us. You ready to go back in time a little bit?
Always.
All right. So today we're going to be looking at the assassination of King Alexander I of Yugoslavia
Okay.
back in 1934. It's a story full of intrigue and violence, and really had some ripple effects across Europe. Our overview of the event, though, have you ever heard of a king getting assassinated on a diplomatic trip?
Oh, yeah. Several.
Really?
Yeah.
And hey, how about this? This assassination ended up kind of helping
Yeah.
the very forces that the assassins were trying to fight.
Yeah. It's a fascinating case study in unintended consequences.
Right.
That you can plan something meticulously and then you end up with the opposite outcome.
It's almost like Hattie,
Yeah.
giving more power to the thing you're trying to take it away from.
Exactly.
Wow. So to really get into this, we need to set the stage.
Yeah.
So let's go back to the aftermath of World War I. This is when the Kingdom of Yugoslavia was formed.
Yeah.
That was a pretty ambitious project, right?
It was incredibly ambitious. The idea was to unite all these different South Slavic people, Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Bosniaks, and others, under one banner. So you're trying to create this brand new nation out of the ashes of a war that had completely redrawn the map of Europe.
Sounds like a recipe for some tension.
Yeah.
You're talking about people with different histories, languages, cultures, religions, and all of a sudden they're being told, like, hey, we're all one big, happy family. Yeah. How did that go over?
Not surprisingly, there were some challenges right from the start.
I imagine.
You know, it's almost like trying to make a smoothie.
Okay.
Out of a bunch of different ingredients, you can blend them all together.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily going to taste good.
Right. Unless you're some kind of smoothie wizard.
True.
All right. So who was the chef
Yeah.
trying to make the smoothie work?
Well, the first king of Yugoslavia was Alexander I. From the House of Karatormic, They're like the nigh head chefs, so to speak. The Serbian royal family. So already you have this inherent power dynamic. You've got a Serbian king ruling over this diverse kingdom.
Definitely adds another layer of complexity there.
Yeah.
So how did King Alexander approach this challenge? Was he trying to blend everyone together, or was he more kind of my way or the highway?
It was a bit of both. And that's what makes his reign so interesting.
Yeah.
He did try to promote unity, but he also, he believed in a strong central government. And remember, this is a time of huge political upheaval across Europe. Democracy was still a relatively new concept, and there are a lot of different ideas about how to run a country floating around.
So what kind of decisions did King Alexander make to try and hold this kingdom together?
He focused on strengthening the central government, and he tried to downplay the different ethnic and religious identities within the kingdom. For example, in 1929, he actually renamed the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes to simply Yugoslavia.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
He thought this would create a sense of national unity. But for a lot of Croats, particularly, it felt like an attempt to erase their identity.
So this renaming might have seemed like kind of a small thing.
Yeah.
But for a lot of Croats, it felt like their identity was being erased. So it's a classic example of how symbolic gestures can have very real and unintended consequences.
Exactly, and it really fueled resentment towards King Alexander, particularly among Croats who felt marginalized and ignored. This brings us to another key player in the story.
Ustaše.
Ah, yes, the Ustaše. They were a Croatian nationalist organization, right?
Yeah.
Not exactly known for their peaceful protests.
Putting it mildly. The Ustaše were a radical fascist organization that believed in violence as a means to achieve their goals.
Their goal was an independent Croatia, completely free from Yugoslavia. They saw King Alexander as the embodiment of their oppression, a symbol of Serbian dominance.
And they were led by Ante Pavelić, right?
Yeah.
I've read some pretty intense stuff about that guy.
Pirle Felić was a charismatic but ruthless leader who believed that terrorism and assassination were legitimate tools to achieve his political goals. So under his leadership, the Ustaše carried out a number of attacks and assassinations aimed at destabilizing the Yugoslav state.
So we've got a kingdom already struggling with internal divisions. We've got a king trying to consolidate his power, and then we've got this radical group determined to achieve independence through violence. What could possibly go wrong?
Well, in 1934, King Alexander decided to embark on a diplomatic trip to France, hoping to strengthen ties and garner support against the growing threat of fascism in Europe. And this would prove to be a fatal decision.
Oh, wow. So he's trying to fight fascism while also suppressing certain groups within his own country.
Right.
Seems a little ironic.
It highlights the complexities of the time. A lot of leaders were grappling with these tensions, trying to maintain order and stability, while also facing these external threats and internal dissent. But for King Alexander, this trip to France would set in motion a chain of events that would change the course of Yugoslav history.
Oh.
The Ustaše had been planning this assassination for months. They saw this diplomatic visit as the perfect opportunity to strike a blow against King Alexander, and they were hoping that it would trigger a wider uprising that would lead to Croatian independence.
So they were hoping to take out the king and trigger a revolution all in one fell swoop. That's a pretty bold plan.
Incredibly risky. And ultimately, it backfired. But at the time, the Ustaše believed that this was their best chance to achieve their goals. They'd even managed to secure support from fascist Italy, which had its own reasons for wanting to see Yugoslavia weakened.
So there's some international players involved as well. It's amazing how these events often have these hidden layers of complexity. So how did the assassination actually play out?
On October 9th, 1934, King Alexander arrived in Marseilles. And, as his motorcade made its way through the city, a man named Vladimir Gernovic, a Bosnian Croat, with ties to the Ustaše, stepped forward. From the cheering crowds, he had been trained for this specific mission, to assassinate the king.
So in a matter of seconds, this seemingly routine diplomatic visit turned into absolute chaos. It really makes you think about how fragile peace can be and how easily things can spiral out of control.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that even in moments that are supposed to be about diplomacy and international cooperation, violence can erupt. And in this case, the assassination had immediate and far-reaching consequences. Not only was King Alexander killed, but the French foreign minister, Louis Barthou, who was riding in the car with him, was also fatally wounded in the crossfire.
Wow, so this one event had a devastating impact on two nations. What happened in the aftermath? Did the Ustaše get what they wanted?
Well, that's where the real irony of this story lies. The assassination, instead of leading to Croatian independence, actually had the opposite effect. It led to a crackdown on Croatian nationalists and further destabilized Yugoslavia.
Wait, so they killed the king, and it made things worse for them. How did that happen?
Well, King Alexander's death created a power vacuum. His son, Peter II, was just 11 years old, so a regency was established under his cousin, Prince Paul. And Prince Paul was tasked with navigating this incredibly turbulent period.
Do you imagine that pressure? Trying to hold together a fragile kingdom, dealing with internal strife, and the looming threat of war in Europe, it must have felt like, trying to juggle chainsaws.
Absolutely. And to make matters worse, the assassination actually played into the hands of the very forces that King Alexander had been trying to fight against, Nazi Germany and fascist Italy.
So this act of violence, meant to weaken Yugoslavia, actually ended up strengthening the very regimes that would eventually invade and occupy the country. That's a pretty tragic twist of fate.
It highlights this recurring theme in history, that violent uprisings often backfire, and they end up strengthening the very forces they aim to weaken. In this case, the assassination created chaos and instability, which made Yugoslavia more vulnerable to external pressures. It also gave these fascist regimes a reason to intervene. They could paint themselves as protectors of order and stability.
So it's almost like the Ustaše inadvertently helped create the conditions that allowed for the rise of fascism in Europe. It's a pretty heavy thought.
It is. And it speaks to the unintended consequences of actions, especially acts of violence. These events have a way of rippling outwards, impacting not just individuals, but entire nations, and in some cases, the course of history itself.
So after the assassination, what happened to Yugoslavia? Did it just completely fall apart?
It held on for a while, but the internal divisions were never truly healed. And in 1941, with war raging across Europe, Yugoslavia was invaded and occupied by Axis powers. And this is where the story takes another dark turn. Remember the USSR?
Yeah.
Well, they saw this invasion
as an opportunity. So they sided with the Nazis.
Yes, they did. With the backing of Nazi Germany, the Ustaše established a puppet state called the Independent State of Croatia, or NDH. So they finally achieved their dream of an independent Croatia, but it came at a terrible price.
I have a bad feeling about this.
Yeah.
What happened under this Ustaše-led state?
Unfortunately, what followed was a horrific chapter in history. Ustaše, fueled by their extreme nationalism and hatred, unleashed a reign of terror, targeting Serbs, Jews, and Roma people within their territory. They set up concentration camps and carried out systematic killings.
So their dream of an independent Croatia turned into a nightmare. And all of this was, at least in part, a consequence
Yeah.
of the assassination of King Alexander III.
It's impossible to say for sure what would have happened if the assassination hadn't taken place. But what we do know is that it set in motion a chain of events. That led to the destabilization of Yugoslavia, the rise of fascism in Europe, and ultimately, the horrific atrocities committed by the Ustaše regime.
It really makes you think about the responsibility of leaders and the dangers of extremism. What started as a seemingly isolated act of violence had ramifications that echoed across generations. So what about King Alexander I? How is he remembered today? Is he seen as a hero, a villain, or something in between?
His legacy is complex and contested. Much like the kingdom he ruled, some view him as a strong leader who tried to forge a unified nation out of this diverse and often fractious population. Others see him as an authoritarian figure who suppressed dissent and fueled the very nationalism that ultimately led to his downfall.
It seems like there's no easy answer, no simple way to judge figures from the past. Their actions and legacies are often shaped by forces beyond their control.
Yeah, that's a key takeaway for any deep dive into history. There's always more to the story, more to learn, and more to understand.
It sounds like King Alexander. I was caught between a rock and a hard place,
Oh,
trying to build a nation, but also dealing with all these internal divisions
yeah.
and external threats. Makes you wonder if things could have turned out differently.
Yeah. That's one of the big what-ifs of history, right? Would Yugoslavia have survived if King Alexander hadn't been assassinated? Would the Ustaše have risen to power? Would they have committed those atrocities? It's impossible to know for sure. But it's definitely a thought-provoking question.
It is. Speaking of what ifs, what happened to Yugoslavia after World War II? Did it just disappear off the map?
Not exactly. After the war, Yugoslavia was reestablished, but this time, under a completely different system. The monarchy was abolished, and a socialist republic was formed under the leadership of Josip Broz Tito.
Oh, Tito. He's considered one of the most important figures in Yugoslav history.
Absolutely. Tito was a complex and fascinating leader. He managed to hold Yugoslavia together for decades. Despite all those ethnic and religious tensions that we've been talking about, he was a communist, but he charted his own course, independent of both the Soviet Union and the West. He created what was known as the non-aligned movement. It was basically a group of countries that refused to take sides in the Cold War.
Switzerland,
Uh-huh.
but on a much larger scale. So he managed to balance all these different groups within Yugoslavia, while also navigating the treacherous waters of Cold War politics. That sounds incredibly challenging.
It was. Tito was a master of realpolitik. You know, he knew how to play the game, both domestically and internationally. He used this combination of repression and persuasion to keep the country unified. He cracked down on nationalist movements, but he also promoted a Yugoslav identity, trying to create this sense of shared purpose and belonging.
And it worked, for a while at least.
Yeah. It worked for a remarkably long time, considering the historical baggage and the constant pressures from both the East and the West. But even Tito couldn't completely erase those deep-seated divisions within Yugoslavia. And after his death in 1980, the country started to unravel. Those old ethnic tensions resurfaced, fueled by economic problems and political opportunism.
And this ultimately led to the Yugoslav Wars of the 1990s, which was a truly tragic period. A brutal and bloody conflict that tore the country apart.
It was a devastating end to Yugoslavia's story, a story that, as we've seen, was marked by both moments of hope and unity and periods of conflict and violence. And it's a story that, in many ways, began with the assassination of King Alexander I.
Wow. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways that you hope our listeners will remember?
I think there are a few important lessons here. First, the assassination of King Alexander I shows how these seemingly isolated acts of violence can have far-reaching and often unintended consequences. It also highlights the fragility of peace and the importance of addressing those underlying social and political tensions before they erupt into violence.
Yeah, it's a reminder that history is not just a series of dates and events. It's a complex tapestry of human choices, actions, and reactions. And sometimes those choices lead to unexpected and tragic outcomes.
Exactly. And as we navigate the challenges of our own time, it's crucial to remember the lessons of the past. We need to understand the complexities of history, recognize the dangers of extremism, and work towards building a more just and peaceful world.
Well said. And for those of you listening out there, we hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of the assassination of King Alexander III and its lasting impact on Yugoslavia and Europe as a whole. And maybe it sparked some questions in your own mind. What if King Alexander had lived? Could the rise of fascism have been prevented? Could Yugoslavia have remained unified? These are all questions without easy answers, but they're worth pondering as we grapple with the complexities of the past and the challenges of building a more peaceful future. Until next time, keep diving deep.